What people really want, I believe, is they want to understand they're working for something bigger than themselves. They want purpose and they want latitude to execute. Because in the Marine Corps, it's a very distributed organization and they teach you how to be a leader. You have to empower decision-making at every single level. If your technology isn't where it needs to be, I think the users and the customers will just drop you.
Nina, welcome to Soul of the CIO, San Francisco or California or Bay Area. I didn't even know what a Bay Area was. You know, it means you've got like 15 cities combined into this huge mega city. I had no idea. Right. I just thought it was one big place. But welcome.
Thank you.
Lovely to see you. Lovely to have you here.
Yeah, happy to be here. Exciting.
The whole show, as we were talking about before, it's predicated on this idea that technology leaders are pretty interesting people. By and large, you know, they have interesting stories, interesting backgrounds, a lot of drive. And from what we know and from talking before, I think this applies to you. I mean, what do you think, Nina?
Most of the best technologists I know really didn't grow up in technology. They grew up in physics. They grew up in the humanities.
And yourself, I mean, it wasn't physics or per se the humanities. It was the military, right? I mean, that's the backdrop. The Marines, to be specific.
That's exactly right. A Marine, probably until I die.
I think let's go back then to the very beginning. How did you end up in the Marines, first of all? Where were you raised? Were you raised in the Bay Area?
My dad is Sicilian, so North Beach and San Francisco. So we spent a lot of time between San Francisco and up north in the North Bay. I just got super excited about this idea of public service. Mm-hmm. I just felt like you have to do something to serve one way or another. You know, whether that's, going to education for a spell or, the medical profession, but you must do something. So I got really excited. This one professor got me excited about serving. And I thought, okay, well, maybe I'll consider, the military, see what they do. I also considered the Peace Corps. And I went to all these offices when I was an undergrad, just completely clueless. And I walked into these offices and I sat down with every military the Navy, the Army, and then I went to the Marines. And so the Navy and the Army kind of laid out, here's all these benefits and features we have if you join us. And I thought, oh, okay, wow, that's exciting. And I remember the Marine Corps just sort of, it was like going on a date, like you're really excited date one, and you're like, oh, I can't wait for them to call me back, and they just never call you back.
By which I mean the Navy and the Army.
The Marine Corps just never called back. The Marine Corps totally ghosted me, and I thought,
sorry to hear that.
okay, what do I have to do here? And I just was young and just, of course, easily influenced by this exciting culture, and signed up. And it is all about kind of shaping a leader. That's their whole ethos.
So they did call you back eventually? They just left you hanging?
No, they did for a sec, enough to think that, potentially I might, not actually be allowed in the Marine Corps, but ultimately they called me back. And I remember the captain working with me the whole summer. He's like, you got to run 3 miles in, 20 minutes. And I was like, oh, I can do that. Like, as soccer players, all they do is run. The big shift, though, I'd like to say, there was like the pre-9/11 Nina, and then there was the post-9/11 Nina. And, 9/11 changed everything for many people.
But you were already
a Marine, yeah.
A Marine at that point. But I guess it
I will tell you,
energized your sense of service and also where you were going to end up.
Yeah, that's right. And also you just spend so much time training that ultimately you realize what you're training for. And of course, 9/11 kicked off a series of military conflicts all over Southwest Asia and the world. So that's when the Marine Corps really shines. That's why it exists, right? And so that brought me, I was going to say, to Afghanistan, and that's really where, so I deployed twice to Iraq and Afghanistan.
Before we get there, can I ask? I can't imagine maybe a more intense scenario to see 9/11 unfold that day than maybe you're on a base, you're in the military already. Like, out of interest, if it's not too personal, where were you? What was that like? What was that day like?
Yeah, I was here in San Francisco, and I decided I would teach algebra for a year.
And you're a Marine teaching algebra to other Marines?
Yeah, I was a reservist. No, I was a reservist.
Right.
And I remember just waking up, normal day, but then, you wake up to the radio and there was just this weird silence, and then the second plane went in. Yeah. And then, that day I ended up reporting into a military installation here in Mountain View, the NASA headquarters. Yeah. It triggered a whole series of events in my life, but I would say everybody was affected one way or another.
And you must have known that day you were going to be in a different part of the world pretty imminently.
I knew something would happen, but I didn't know how they were going to do it.
Before we visit your experiences in Afghanistan that did, I think, from reading about your career, influence and forge what you later will become as a tech leader, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And we get into that in a second, but I'm just interested as well because obviously sport, athletics, military, public service, all of these really influential currents in your youth. What about technology? Was that also something, and obviously you're surrounded by technology as well in this part of the world.
Absolutely.
It's in the DNA of a place, right?
Well, I got really interested in technology, I think, when I went to Afghanistan. I was part of a team, they're like a special operations team. They're called Civil Military Affairs Units, and essentially they work with host governments like the United Nations or the State Department. So we were Marines in uniform working with these entities to execute on the campaign strategy that had been developed.
Right.
And so the element that we were responsible for was, building a school system. And my counterpart was a doctor, and his responsibility was to build a medical system and a 911 system. I mean, these are very sophisticated elements of a mature communities. And I think we all realized when we got there, we really need to start at really the very basics and build schools, not build the school system, right? So we had to start from the ground up. And so that's when I think, what's that classic line? Like everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face.
Mike Tyson. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
So it's really about adapting and trying to deliver on the outcomes that were expected, but just being flexible and ensuring you can meet the needs of the people that were, part of that.
And did you have that responsibility almost instantly to help implement a school system?
Yeah, it was the school system until we realized that the country had no systems.
Yeah. But you went out there knowing you were going to have an infrastructure role. That was something you created for yourself, or you orientated your military career around or towards? What was that?
Well, one of the beauties of being a Marine is that you learn how to plan quickly, and there's frameworks for planning, and you can develop plans, and they very tightly aligned all the way from, the campaign, the long-term strategies. Maybe a long-term strategy in military terms would be something like, stabilize and rebuild the country.
Yeah.
Which is like massive, right?
Yeah.
Right. So how do you align to that? What are the elements that stabilize and rebuild countries? And so then everything is done on teams in the military. There's no individual planning. That does not work because there's so many elements that are interlocked that you must account for. So essentially, you get in a room with your counterparts, and then you develop a plan, and then you spread that out. What entities do we need to actually execute on the plan? So it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger until you have this massive collaboratively built plan to include the host country, right? So that's another piece. So the planning cycle takes as quick as it needs to or as long as it needs to. And in that particular case, it took like probably 7 months to get that plan sorted, only to find out there are no systems existing here. There's nothing to fix. We have to build the whole thing. Yeah. You had asked about where technology fit in. Well, when we got there, our particular piece also included things like economic development. So one of the pieces that my counterpart built was he essentially got wireless telecom antennas installed in the western part of the country, which borders Iran. And that kind of transformed and changed the Afghans' life almost like within a summer, right? They all had like 15 phones, and it was really transformative for them to be able to communicate. And so then you realize how technology does actually transform communities. And then I remember we brought in 1 laptop per child. That was interesting because they'd never actually, they were barely literate, a lot of the young kids and even the adults. However, you could see things start to shift when they realized like there was a whole massive world out there. And so that's when I started really getting into technology. And then when I completed my 13th month deployment to Afghanistan, I ended up actually on Capitol Hill working in a senator's office. And I was a defense fellow. And what that is every year the Department of Defense sends to Capitol Hill fellows from each service. And the fellows work on various portfolios, and my portfolio was technology and defense. And so I worked on short takeoff vertical lift platforms like the V-22 Osprey, which is a hyper-sophisticated plane/helicopter. That it's just Google it and you'll be like, oh, that's totally crazy. And essentially what it is the requirements are coming out for the Department of Defense. And then, there's only so many companies that can build these things. So it was really focused on the big five at the time. And that was, Raytheon, Boeing, BAE Systems. And then you start to see this vantage point on how technology can solve some very complex problems that only the Pentagon can dream up. But so that was really my entree into, technology. And then I started to get really interested, and I worked with DARPA, which, is very early stage R&D, throw it all against a wall, whatever sticks, we're going to go after. Even if it doesn't seem to solve a problem today, it potentially could solve a problem we don't even know about. That they have this massive latitude to invest in any kind of R&D. So that was fascinating. So that was a special time. And so I just kind of took that and came back to the Bay Area and go, I think I love technology. I think I love how it changes and can transform. And so
I was going to say any DARPA projects you can talk about, because I've read a bit about it, and I don't know how much you could even talk about, right? DARPA's pretty, what's the word? If you can't discuss something publicly, it's
classified.
Classified. DARPA's pretty classified. Is my anything you can talk about, anything that you worked upon.
One of my favorite projects that isn't at all classified. Sure, they have plenty classified, but they also are one of the largest funders of R&D at the large universities.
Right.
And they do a lot of kind of X Prize, competitions.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of it's open source, and one in particular that I thought was wild. It was robotic hummingbirds. This is at Carnegie Mellon, because they fund a lot of big universities' research, and computer science is one of their largest areas. And this was at Carnegie Mellon. It was robotic hummingbirds that were machine learning programmed that flew around in swarms and were capable of, one, independently attacking things, and two, swarming to attack things. And this is open source, so you could just Google it. Carnegie Mellon, deadly hummingbirds. Just the concept that somebody would come up with like killer hummingbirds is awesome.
Killer hummingbirds, bring them back, I say.
Yeah,
let's
right?
Take them off the shelf, dust them down. Oh, that's amazing.
Soul of the CIO is sponsored by Nextvink. Now, if you work in IT, you'll know too well how disruptions can derail productivity fast. Nextvink's AI-powered platform for digital employee experience keeps you ahead. It uncovers issues others can't see and resolves them automatically with employee-centric AI and always-on automation. Employees stay productive, IT stays proactive and even preventative, and leadership sees results. Nextvink, ahead of every IT disruption, behind every strategy. Learn more at nextvink.com.
You've since had a lot of sort of corporate and public sector experience, but at that time, then you've got the contrast between military planning, Marines efficiency, Marines processes, and then political processes. And I was wondering, first of all, what the contrast is like between those two, or was like to witness.
That's a great question. And I'm thankful that you actually realize there is a massive distinction between an entity like a military organization who is all about getting things done, right? Developing plans, executing on the plans, and delivering. That's their core.
How would you define the political approach?
Competency, yeah. You know how people say, well, there's politics in everything. And that is true. But nothing is as political as Washington, D.C. At that time, 2012, it was also an election year, so it was sort of amplified, the political piece. I don't think I fully understood that relationship between the policymakers in a country and the executive branch or the execution branch in a country. They're driven by different motives. They are seeking different outcomes. And in our country specifically, you know, there's 50 small kingdoms, and those 50 small kingdoms are represented by the Congress. And so they have different aims and initiatives and not to mention political funding that can steer you one way or another. depending on your, election cycle. I think I walked away from Washington, D.C. with this understanding, deeds and words. If you say you're going to do something, do they actually do it? Do you actually do it? So ensure you could do it before you say it, right? And that can minimize, this perception that you're not a person of deeds. You're a person of words. And they are professionals in Washington, D.C. as a person of words. Professionals. I mean, there is nothing, maybe the British, they're also very good. But there is nothing as slick as a Washington, D.C. politician. But that might be true, too, in the UK, incredible.
They're not so slick over there. No, I don't know. Yeah. It's the Obama era as well. I mean, he was...
he was incredible. He was
quite
incredible.
A communicator.
Yeah, fabulous. But I think Congress is, so why that matters? Because, that old adage, follow the money?
Yeah.
That is absolutely true in Washington, D.C. You really need to keep asking the question to understand why they're making the choices they make, why they've decided to sign on to that legislation, because it's not a rational environment. It's totally irrational.
So the contrast actually couldn't be more violent, effectively.
Oh, yeah. I remember General McChrystal, who was, he was relieved from being the general in Afghanistan, running the whole campaign. He essentially said there's the long screwdriver of policy, and it starts in Washington, D.C. And every little quarter turn they make in Washington, D.C. is like 7 revolutions on the battlefield. And I remember thinking, that seems so stark of an image, right? Until I got there. And then I realized, the power they wield in Congress is extensive, right? Just by a stroke of a pen, just by funding this program as opposed to that program, changes lives like 10x on the ground.
And were you having to sort of deduce these factors about Washington because they enabled you to do your job, or was it a bit more like you were just registering it for your own personal information about points? You know what I mean?
Well, as a Marine, you're very loyal to the Marine Corps. So whatever I was able to register, I immediately reported back to my commanding officer, which was a colonel. And essentially, I tried to ensure they didn't, as an entity, what I could, I didn't, obviously not the whole Marine Corps, but like what I could kind of warn them what potentially was coming, and maybe you need to send somebody up to brief this about this particular investment because they don't seem very confident in it. And before that gets too far, let's get up there. And they would send like a specialist, a general up there to talk about a specific program or potentially a product that was being built. And these were airframes, so they were, $76 million a piece. So, that's how I used it. But as I kind of, as a fellow, just to be clear, as a fellow, you're like very dangerous, but you also are gone in a year. So you have to, they'll let you in as far as they think they can let you in, knowing full well, where your loyalties lie. And
tempted to call this your Anakin Skywalker era,
Oh, I like it.
You're not a Star Wars
I'm a massive Star Wars fan.
Okay, you get the illusion, man.
Yeah. Do or not do. There is no try.
There you go.
I had that hanging in my office.
So we're contrasting the political and the marine approaches. What about then adding the corporate approach? What's it most similar to? What are its unique? What are its unique qualities, etc.?
Any leadership position you're in, it doesn't matter public sector or corporate, you have got to be in the people business. And I think the sooner you realize that, the better off you're going to be and the more successful you and your organization will be. And what do I mean by that? You have to empower decision-making at every single level, right? You can't control and funnel decisions through you. I think that kills organizations and teams in a way that's just demoralizing. So you have to encourage the team to lead from where you're at, because in the Marine Corps, it's a very distributed organization, and they enculturate you and they teach you how to be a leader at your level, right? But in the Marine Corps, we also believe that a 19-year-old can, be a hero in the midst of like the most chaotic situation. So I like that framework because I take that framework with me when I'm, leading teams or running organizations, and I convey that to them. If you see change that needs to happen, you execute on the change. Nobody will, use good judgment, obviously, but evaluate it, make a decision, and execute. You will never get in trouble for thinking you did the best thing you could do at the moment in time you were in. That's not something we're going to punish.
That's well put.
Yeah, and I think that's important for people to understand. And if what people really want, I believe, is like they want to understand they're working for something bigger than themselves, they want purpose, and they want latitude to execute. Mm-hmm. I think organizations really get uncomfortable, the people in them, when you start to micromanage it. And so that is all from the Marine Corps, because they give you a lot of latitude, believing, like I said, full well that a 19-year-old could potentially change the course of a chaotic day. And so I believe that.
It's not an instinctive belief you encounter so instantly in the private sector, perhaps.
It's not instinctive, but I still carry it with me. And everybody needs to understand the strategy. Because if you understand the strategy of the organization and how you fit like a nesting doll, your piece into a larger effort, then you can make decisions because you know ultimately what the main goal is, right? And if you execute ethically and you execute with integrity, then you're moving this whole organization closer to that big strategic goal, whatever it is. In the Marine Corps, we are very methodical about everybody understanding what is the initiative, what is the mission, and why are we doing this. I would say in the corporate world, it's important that you actually, explicitly, methodically go to the lowest level to make sure everybody understands what we're doing and why we're doing it. And sometimes I think that's missed because people are busy.
In the tech sector in particular, there's like a fluidity of aim as well, right? Somewhere like Silicon Valley, where we are. There's going to be a lot of organizations which are trying to figure out what it is they're selling, how to sell it, and revising that on the fly. That's a very distinct kind of DNA for an organization as against the military or even against politics now.
I think there are talented people in those organizations that can take that, big thinking that you find in the Bay Area and operationalize it in a way to move the organization. You need those people as much as you need the visionaries. Otherwise, it just generally doesn't come to fruition, Like you need the Sheryl Sanders to turn it into something real. You need the chief operating officer of OpenAI to make sure that this organization has the right policies, procedures, execution, links to strategy. I'm much more of a practical, show me person.
Sure.
What do they say? Demo, not memo. Show me what you're doing.
You went into this interview thinking, well, how do you end up from a Marine to a CIO and to now a CTS, right, at Lenovo?
Yeah.
And now it makes perfect sense. The Marines are basically trying to turn you into the perfect tech executive leader, seemingly. Or not intending to, but certainly doing so. But so when you finish with being a fellow, where do we go next, and how do we end up in the CIO position?
When I finished up being a fellow, I immediately got in my car and said, I'm moving back to California. DC is wild and crazy, and I need to just leave it in the review. So went back to Berkeley, took a few classes, was on my way to getting a PhD. And it's funny because I was really interested in online learning. And I thought that is the new frontier, right? That's how we're all going to go learn eventually. And I was at Naval Postgraduate School, which is in Monterey, concurrently getting my PhD at Berkeley. And I really got into data and performance measurement because as you take a few of these courses when you get your graduate degree, And my advisor, she was the former president of Smith College, and she ran a tiny little office in Berkeley. I mean, tiny, you can't even say it was an office. I think it was a closet. And they had put her in there and said, okay, you're the Center for Emerging Technology and Learning. And I basically sought her out and I said, hey, would you be my advisor? This is what I'd like to do, kind of like measuring the impact of online learning. And I was using the Naval Postgraduate School position. I was the deputy of online learning programs as sort of my, kind of like changing how they educated military officers around the world. Because the military has a long history of educating officers while they're not, on site. It's all kind of used to be a box of books, and then you try to learn your graduate program. And then it got to, as learning management systems became, the internet came, learning management systems became more sophisticated. It got to, learning by way of, online and synchronized videos and all this. Okay, so essentially it's got a long history of that. And I was like, we got to do this better. Like, I think there's better ways to teach using learning management systems, right? You can't teach like Sage on the Stage type where you're all in there listening to the professor.
Mm-hmm.
You got to do it differently. Like Coursera's perfected it, all these massive open online course platforms were coming online. So long story short, I was going through the program and she was wonderful. And then I got really distracted by this position at the Department of Technology in San Francisco. And it was the chief of strategy and performance. And I was like, oh, that is a cool job. I'm going to go after that job. And that's all it took, one distraction. And I never finished the PhD.
How far into it were you?
I was like 4 years. And I remember trying to write my dissertation, which is the hardest part, because you really are thrown off a cliff and try to and in the interim, my advisor became the chancellor at Berkeley.
Okay.
Yeah, Carol Christ. She was fabulous. And she'd always used to, I'd send her an email like once a year, knowing, she's overly busy and like, my God, how annoying. This kid has not finished anything, and I'm like, I was still working on the dissertation. And she'd be like, oh yeah, come
After
by.
you left, or yeah, still doing it.
Because you're kind of still connected.
She saw through, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then finally she sort of said, do you actually think you're a PhD at heart? And I sort of said, I think I'm more of a person of action, to be honest. And she goes, have you ever considered the business school? And I said, well, no, what do you think? And she goes, you should consider the business school.
Mm-hmm.
She goes, let me just call over there real quick. And so, did all the prerequisites. And she essentially was like, okay, you're going to end your Berkeley relationship, get through this. And sure enough, left Berkeley with the MBA, not the PhD.
Yeah.
But actually, it's just much better, right? Because ultimately, we're back to people and running organizations. PhDs, that's kind of the wrong skill set.
This is your, raison d'etre, the big project, the big organization. And who are you working for then? This is San Francisco.
Yeah, San Francisco, City and County, San Francisco.
Right.
I was the chief of staff and then strategy and performance. So that's where I really got to understand IT and the IT services portfolio. And
how did that contrast with that experience in Afghanistan?
Oh, it was like night and day. Night and day.
You had an existing infrastructure,
Yeah, exactly. Existing infrastructure, massive city, going through a lot of change, hardcore technologists.
Yep.
So that was great. But then we're back to, it's all about the people. It's all about, understanding what the customers want, understanding the users, ensuring that you can clearly convey that portfolios of projects, which is what most people care about, and consistently deliver the services, which have to run 24/7, 365.
And this would seem to align with the general direction of travel in IT through that period, right? Not just your experience. I mean, we're sponsored by NextThink there, who coined the term digital employee experience, that employee-centric kind of ethos of approach. I mean, how is that determining your career growth of that period through what you were doing?
It wasn't as prevalent as, say, the private sector had adopted it, knowing full well that, customers generate revenue, and to meet the customer where they're at and wrap all the services around them, UX, UI, the whole thing, make it frictionless. Public sector IT was really, hardcore service, consistent, never down, and it was going through a full transformation. And I think that is because there is so many lines of business to support. You really need flexible architectures to ensure, the controller can execute on her remit, and all the way over here to the permitting department who can lease permits to residents so they can, one, build their deck or do their add-on, or the contractor can build the building. And so there wasn't really a spirit of that. It was just more a push model. And so now that is shifting, and it's going to be consistently shifting because public sector IT is always a little behind. And that is because of many reasons, the legislation putting in multiple gates in place so they don't actually, step out of the law. And obviously none of this stuff was born in the digital era. So it's not digitally tuned, right? You'd have to burn it all down and start over, to be honest, if you really wanted it as smooth as, say, Amazon, which I oftentimes used to hear, and I'd think, well, we're never going to get there, but we can prove.
Yeah.
But I will say, like San Francisco yesterday just rolled out Copilot for Enterprise to 30,000 employees, which that's a step in the right direction.
And that's something you've spoken about, right? Like preparing for AI transformation, that kind of tension in the public sector in particular between efficiencies and innovation and the need to be very cautious and responsible in your rollout. I mean, what's your kind of key advice for doing that sort of transformation successfully at the moment?
We have got to get out of the toilet bowl swirl of POCs, right? Which you can just die in a POC swirl. I think there are many elements in the processes that are ripe for transformation, and leveraging a tool like AI, machine learning, however you want to convey it. A key piece of that is going to be the business line adopting a new way to do things. And it won't be, the technology is never going to save you. It's going to be the people evaluating how they're doing things today, ensuring that they change it and meeting the technology where it's at versus meeting the people where they're at. Because the technology now is uber sophisticated and it can revamp your whole process to ensure that you can deliver to the consumer. So I think, many people need to be involved in this. And I think we need to kind of change our paradigm. Before I would have said, look, you need to meet the people where they're at. But honestly, if you really want to fundamentally shift how the public sector delivers, the organization needs to shift, right, and meet the technology where it's at. And of course, human in the loop, leverage the technology appropriately, but you need to really step back and reevaluate how you're doing everything. So it's exciting to see some cities pushing that forward. Like I know Mayor Lurie in San Francisco is absolutely positively excited about the prospects. Saw some very interesting things in New York City. They're trying to push it. So I'm hopeful.
Do you ever look over your shoulder and think, how would this technology have made things different in Afghanistan, in the Northeast, or what fresh challenges and opportunities would it have presented, and might it be offering to the military now in different parts of the world?
Well, certainly as evidenced by the 4 winning bidders of the $200 million contracts in the Pentagon, that the Pentagon is absolutely believing that this is going to fundamentally transform warfare.
So to come back to your career and where you were there, when did you first get an eyeful of the CIO role and think, this might be something where I could really extend my talents on a new scale in a new context? And how did you develop into that position?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was at San Francisco, and then a role opened up in Santa Clara County. So I said, I'm going to try that because the scope is much bigger. Everything is much bigger in Santa Clara County. It's just a massively wealthy county with a huge IT department because it was consolidated. And that's another piece I think that's really important. If you really want to fundamentally transform a massive organization, you need to give the CIO a lot of power to execute on that. They need control of the data scientists. They need control of the transformation elements, like a business process remapper, for example. Certainly the infrastructure. I had this fabulous CIO I worked for. He was the chief technology officer and became the CIO. So he was my most reluctant CIO I probably worked with because he really loved the technology. I mean, he would spend his weekends building Enigma machines. He was fabulous. And we just got through together. I said, look, this is very similar to an Afghan war zone. And I know exactly how to operate in that. So we're going to just push through it. We did it, right?
For a CIO or in that kind of technology leadership role, what are the analogies between the pandemic landscape and an Afghan war zone?
The heartbeat of a war zone is the operations center. It absolutely positively knows everything going on in that space from top to bottom, left to right. So, and who's in there and why they're in there and what are they executing on exactly? Where does it fit in the strategy? So when you think about what was happening in the pandemic, it was very chaotic, right, initially, because nobody really totally understood it. So essentially you become, the emergency operations centers start to control the environment, right? And when you're in a war zone, you're just in the midst of a massive emergency operations center.
Sure. Yeah.
Right? So, and there's a hierarchy, and there's decisions being made very quickly, and there's fast track procurement. Initially, we had a few departments that did not want to transition off desktops, right? They were very comfortable with their desktops, which is totally cool and fine. And some of them actually needed them because they needed the compute power, and it's just more expensive if you try to invest in a massive, and some of the laptops don't even meet the compute power they needed. So I get it, right? But everybody had to go home. So I remember chatting with the team. We need, like 6,000, 7,000 more laptops, right? We don't even have enough laptops. And so it was, hunting out a supply chain that could provide for us so these employees could be productive. And thank God we did that initially because it really dried up. The supply chains really dried up. And, productivity is the key when you're in a situation like that, right? Like people need to stay engaged. They need to stay online. They need to stay connected. We learned all of this, right? So I'm just sort of reiterating the moment. But move fast, deliver. Right, those are the priorities in a situation like that. So that's the similarities.
And now you're at Lenovo, and your role is a chief tech strategist. So
yes.
That's a big transition. For all the transitions you've made, this is another significant one, right? From the public sector, which through different forms has been a consistent thing for your preceding career, into the explicit private sector specifically. Right. Why have you made that transition, and what's the remit of this new mission?
So I think after my MBA, I got super excited about this idea that, one, there's just a lot to do. I met so many interesting people when I was in my MBA program doing all kinds of cool, interesting things, entrepreneurs, certainly tech executives, engineers that wanted to, build a startup. And it was international. So we had people from Ukraine who was running this massive logistics company to a couple of developers from China who, were starting an AI video company. So I thought, there's a lot more to do in the world. And then I got a phone call from one of the VPs at Lenovo. And she said, I'm building out this public sector portfolio, would love to have you come. You have all the right skill sets, and, you can talk to CIOs. And they're our customers, the CIOs in the public sector. And I said, I have a lot of empathy for them. Because obviously I understand what they're going through. I'm happy to help the sales teams and the marketing teams. So, and then the latest, which actually just to come full circle, is we're heading out and going after the federal market. So that's exciting because that's a environment I'm totally familiar with. I know how they think. I come from that side of the world at one point. So, how do we convey value to an organization like that? It's really important that you have people that have, worn that uniform or been in that ecosystem because they think differently,
Touched upon it already, but how should public sector CIOs be preparing for AI transformation presently? More explicitly, what elements of that message haven't you touched upon so far?
Well, certainly there's the people. So you got to educate the workforce, right, to get them fluid in the language. There's collaborating with your peers who have various remits, but essentially you're kind of all under the same umbrella. Privacy, CISO, so important. Chief Security Officer, so important. There's certainly understanding in conjunction with like the Chief People Officer or HR, how are we going to evolve this workforce to leverage the tools? And I think that is something that has come up quite a bit. There's what CIOs, I believe, can be doing right now, if they're not moving quickly on integrating new tools into the ecosystem, is fixing all the data. I mean, the data is in a state of disarray from there's gaps. It's not labeled appropriately. Essentially, it's not on, cloud-based servers or anything. So you can really kind of prep a lot internally to leverage the tools appropriately, because I think everybody understands now, like those technologies can't do much if your data's not sorted appropriately. Classification's a big one, right? It needs to be labeled, needs to be categorized, it needs to be managed appropriately. I think also what we're seeing too is you have to be able to ensure you can evolve the organization's skill set. So, thinking about today, is not what the CIO should be doing. They should be thinking like 3 years. So how am I going to get the skill sets in here to leverage the tools? And do I need developers anymore? Do I need integration engineers? Like what sort of skill sets am I going to need in 2 or 3 years? And start now, because, public sector budget cycles are fairly slow. And when the time comes, you want to make sure you kind of hit the mark right when you need to hit the mark.
And should they be thinking about like facilitating greater digital dexterity in the user base, and how should they be approaching the challenge of digital adoption at scale as well for all these new technologies, do you think?
You really need to understand that build versus buy conversation. Like internally, are you actually capable of building this, or should we be going out to the marketplace and really leveraging the latest technology? And I think that's what you really need to prepare for your users for, right? You really need to build the future organization, not the current organization. Even the future organization is a little bit of a gamble, but I just don't think the here and now is the type of organization CIOs need to be running. They need to be running that organization.
And that's something you've spoken about before. CIOs need to focus less on managing infrastructure, a bit more on focusing on driving those business outcomes.
Yes.
And it seems to me that that's maybe something sourced at that experience in the Marines, right? I mean, business outcomes is a different way of talking about it. But
yep.
Thinking about big picture strategic aims, right, and how they play into that, would you say?
I absolutely agree that. I mean, I think the CIO role in particular is this nexus of the CEO is looking at the CIO to drive change, right? Leverage the technology to a point where either we can increase revenue, bring more value to our customers, ensure that our customers are happy with the, applications we're putting in the marketplace. And that's actually been very interesting. Customers will leave you if your technology isn't where it needs to be. And they get to decide how that technology is being used and leveraged, which is, I mean, consistently we tell, technologists, you need to go from the user's perspective inward and build the tools to deliver. But oftentimes, because the role is so massive, some of the time it's like they don't have the luxury to do that, right? So you have to consistently remind yourself, like, always be talking to your users. How do your users like what you're delivering? So that's important, because I think the users and the customers will just drop you, right? There's so many options now in the marketplace. I don't think totally we understand how it's going to look with AI kind of in our ecosystem, but knowing that these skill sets that were useful, relevant, and necessary for the last 10 years are probably going to be useful, relevant, and necessary in the next 10 years. And so ensure you're making the investment in your peers, specifically like the CFO, and the CEO, and the COO. Because if you really want to drive change, it's the operations that need to transform. And that could be as easy as like taking them to lunch, having a chat over a coffee, just maintaining that relationship. So when you're coming to them for whatever millions of dollars you need, that you're not, that's not the first time you're talking to them.
Good advice.
Yeah,
good advice. Given that kind of the distinct unknowableness of the next 5-10 years, right, in technology, what advice would you have for ambitious young technologists in the workplace today? What skills or outlooks do they need to cultivate in themselves?
Always work on the hardest, most abstract projects. Always just do your best. You're going to shine, right? But you got to put yourself really in something that you're not comfortable, and that's the key to growth. So I would say that for sure. Always keep learning. I mean, I'm enrolled in an AI program at MIT. I don't know everything. There's just no way, right? But consistently, constantly learning about your craft, right? So you can speak about it and hang with the conversations. I mean, you certainly are going to get into conversations where, you meet the chief architect and they have taken you into another realm. But that's okay. You just have to recognize when you're out of your depth and admit like you're out of your depth.
Yeah.
Oftentimes I see people don't admit it, and I think, okay, come on, we don't really know what he's talking about, do we? Like the killer hummingbirds. Like, how do they work? I have no idea. That would be my advice. Always keep learning, and absolutely positively make time to go talk to other people all the time. Go out for coffee, right? Even if it seems like I don't think we're ever going to work together. You just never know. that person can end up on your panel for an interview for the role you want. And now you have a relationship with them because you just basically made the effort. And that's difficult with young people because they actually, their whole like worldview was shifted so dramatically because of COVID. But you have to really hit that point home that it's valuable to make the connections.
Interested, sort of final question or topic, if looking back over your whole career, started out obviously distinctly inspired by and driven by the idea of public service. I would say, talking to you maybe the last 10 years or so, very inspired by innovation. And I was wondering, do you see those things as like in any way mutually exclusive or separate sources of professional inspiration, or do you see them as very complementary? And what do you see as driving you in the next 5-10 years?
Certainly, when I think about the time with DARPA, I mean, that is the most cutting edge organization I think I've ever been around. And R&D, right, in our big universities or even our small universities has to continue to happen. They are always pushing envelopes, 90% of which we don't hear about or know about. And so that's important. So I think, everybody agrees like that they're part of the public sector remit, higher education, right? When I think about K-12 schools doing things differently and just the kids now, the young ones, they just don't have the same worldview, right? That has evolved so fast. I just hope they find their way to public service at some point, like I was inspired when I was younger. Hopefully they're inspired to, and I think they are because they seem much smarter than we ever were. So that's encouraging. I think when I think about the next few years, I think it's so exciting to think about how Lenovo could go after this federal market because we have great products and services. And also sponsor of the World Cup, so a lot of our technologies are in and around the game. And that was cool to see this summer in the FIFA World Cup Club Championship, but also next year, it's going to be exciting to see what they do, and it's exciting to compete. I think we have a place in the market and I want to be part of that team that brings that to the market. So people have options,
You're going to go to some games, get some
tickets, absolutely.
So.
Yeah, I've been trying to work my way, but it's a lottery system.
Nini, you've had an amazingly interesting career, and it's been wonderful speaking to you. Thanks so much for making the time visiting us here.
Enjoyed it. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.